Road, and a welcome to everyone, and thanks for joining the fourth day of the 2021 McCain Conference. And I'm Ed Barrett, Research Director of the Stockdale Center for Ethical Leadership at the U.S. Naval Academy. On our final day of exploring the ethics of spying, we'll focus on ethical permissions and prohibitions that apply to human intelligence collection, HUMINT, and to covert action. Sir David Omand joins us from the UK, where he teaches intelligence ethics at King's College London. Previously, his posts in British government service included Security and Intelligence Coordinator in the Cabinet Office after 9/11, Permanent Secretary of the Home Office, Director of the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, and Deputy Undersecretary of State for Policy in the Ministry of Defense. He is the co-author of Principle of Spying, The Ethics of Secret Intelligence, and his latest book is How Spies Think, 10 Lessons from Intelligence. David, thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
And on a covert action, we have Mr. Mitt Regan. He's the McDevitt Professor of Jurisprudence and co-director of the Center for the Study of the Legal Profession at Georgetown University Law Center. Before joining Georgetown, he served as law clerk on the U.S. Supreme Court to Justice Brennan and on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit to then Judge Ruth Bader Ginsberg. His latest book is entitled BigLaw, Money and Meaning in the Modern Law Firm. And thankfully, Mitt is a senior fellow at the Stockdale Center. So thanks to you, Mitt. And finally, to the attendees, please send me questions as they occur to you during the presentations via the chat function. And as usual for the midshipmen, please preface your question with MIDN. Sir David, thank you again for joining us, and the floor is yours on human intelligence.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation. Great to be talking to you all. Where does one start? You start a long way back. Secret intelligence has been part of the human story, certainly from Old Testament times, as the book of Joshua relates. Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent out two men as spies. He told them, go look at that country, especially the city of Jericho. So they went to Jericho and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab to spend the night there. And that reference to the relationship between the two oldest professions is one I'm going to return to later in my talk. So let me start by reminding us of the primary purpose of gathering intelligence, which is to improve the quality of decision-making by reducing the ignorance of the decision makers, be they military commanders, policymakers, or presidents, about what they face. There's an essential input to many of their decisions that comes from secret intelligence. That is, reducing the ignorance of the decision maker in respect of information that others don't want us to have, information that has therefore to be stolen. Now, we know who these others are. They're the hostile autocrats and their armed forces, terrorists, narcotics traffickers, cyber criminal gangs, all intent on doing things that will harm us. And they will go to extraordinary, often very violent lengths to prevent us accessing their secrets. The inhabitants of the peaceful city of Salisbury in England learned this when Russian military intelligence sent two assassins to kill Lieutenant Colonel Skripal, a former GRU officer who had helped MI6, the British Secret Service. And they spread a banned nerve agent, Novichok, but they only succeeded in killing an innocent bystander. We need protection from such people, and for that, secret intelligence is indispensable. And that means, in turn, equipping intelligence officers with the means to overcome the will of the person with the secret, who's determined not to give it up. And intelligence professionals have always argued, therefore, that their difficult and sometimes dangerous job, one that they exercise on our behalf, requires us to accept that they're going to break normal ethical conventions. And without that ethical license, we will acquire no secret intelligence by definition. And by ethics here, I simply mean the straightforward dictionary definition of ethics as a social, religious, or civil code of behavior considered correct, especially that of a particular group, profession, or individual. So having an ethical code of conduct is, in a sense, a defining condition for a profession. We don't expect teachers to seduce their students, lawyers to embezzle the client's money, scientists to fiddle their results, or naval officers to disregard, military officers to disregard the Geneva Conventions governing armed conflict. So the issue is, how far do we want to go in licensing an ethical code for those that we employ to gather intelligence, which is different from that we would expect to apply in everyday life? Put another way, what don't our citizens want intelligence officers to be allowed to do on their behalf? And you'll recognize the parallel with the just war tradition that led to the laws of war to reconcile conflicting ethical requirements. States have a duty to defend their citizens and justice. Protecting the innocent, however, does require willingness to use force at times, but deliberately taking or harming human life is wrong. And just war thinking reconciles these opposites by insisting that first, the causes of war must be just, jus ad bellum, and once we're in armed conflict, our behavior must be just, jus in bello. So an ethical code that seeks to minimize unnecessary suffering, such as by protecting innocent civilians and surrendering enemy units. For the just conduct of intelligence, jus in intelligentio, you might call it, we can also derive ethical principles from the just war tradition. And I think these can be of practical use in the management and oversight of secret intelligence activity. And I'll mention 6 such principles. Let me emphasize, this is not a tick box exercise, but it's just a set of concepts to help untangle the ethical issues that need consideration. Modern digital intelligence, by the way, bristles with ethical issues over privacy invasions and so on. But today I'm only talking about the ethical risks that arise with human agents. We should remember, however, that today the ideal well-placed agent may be somebody with good access to the IT system rather than the traditional diplomat or policy official. Digital and human intelligence are no longer in separate boxes. So the first ethical principle that I suggest is right intention. Acting with integrity, having no hidden political or other agendas behind intelligence activity, and indeed the presentation of intelligence judgments to decision makers. This is the area that saw the controversy in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The second principle is the one we all recognize: proportionality, keeping the ethical risks of operations in line with the seriousness of the harm that the operations are intended to mitigate. Just give you an example. It was reported that one of the top British agents inside the Provisional IRA during the later stages of their campaign in Northern Ireland in the 1990s was the man who was their enforcer, whose job was to root out informers inside the IRA, torture them to confess, and then execute them and dump their bodies in a bog. It's a huge ethical risk to contemplate having such a thug as your agent. But without high-grade intelligence from sources inside the IRA reporting that they were looking for a way out without surrendering, would Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, have had the confidence to allow secret back-channel discussions with terrorists that led eventually to the successful peace process in Northern Ireland? And it's quite likely that the motive of an agent inside a criminal organization is to avoid prosecution for past crimes rather than simply to help. The local police in friendly countries are usually helpful in tipping us off when they catch the Russians or the Chinese or a North Korean diplomat in drunk driving or other misbehavior that might get them sent home in disgrace. is it ethically acceptable to offer to have the charges dropped if the individual agrees to cooperate? The next ethical principle I would highlight is right authority. The more ethically risky the operation, the higher the level of command authority that should be required. And the principle of right authority provides for accountability for decisions, oversight, an audit trail of who agreed to what, essential to defend the reputation of the service when things go wrong, as they are bound to from time to time. And good practice here is to have sign-off from an experienced officer of the service who's not in the direct chain of command, acting as an ethical supervisor to spot if agents are being allowed to participate in criminal acts, or the case officer is getting a bit too close to the agent themselves. Collusion in wrongdoing is an ethical risk, and it's almost always associated with the recruitment of agents within terrorist and criminal organizations. Yet it's information from such active participants that may be the most likely to save lives. And any agent of value may well be required by the gang to commit an atrocity to ensure that there's no going back. We saw that with the so-called Islamic State. And who is to know what the agent is up to when they're out of the case officer's sight? Can an American or British government really run as an agent an individual who's committing murder or robbing banks? The next principle is a reasonable prospect of success. And this was originally came out of the just war tradition to prevent vainglorious operations in pursuit of medals and glory. So that this is a principle about having adequate justification for imposing serious risk on others. At the time of one of the greatest times of East-West confrontation, MI6, Secret Service and the CIA were jointly running the Colonel Oleg Penkovsky in Moscow. He provided thousands of pages of documents, including a description of how Soviet medium-range missile bases would be constructed. And that provided crucial clues during the Cuban Missile Crisis that the missile sites were not yet operational. And that gave the President Kennedy just enough time to impose the successful naval blockade of Cuba and defuse the situation. But lapses in tradecraft came when under pressure from his case officers to report even more, eventually led to Penkovsky's exposure, arrest, and torture. And he died reportedly being thrust alive into a furnace, filmed for colleagues as a warning of what happened to traitors to the Soviet Union. Next, I would highlight discrimination in its original meaning the ability to assess and manage the risk of collateral harm to those who are not the object of the operation. What, for example, do we think today of the ethics of the CIA during the Vietnam War, setting up a front company, Air America, to transport opium base for the poppy growing Hmong people, hill people of Laos, in return for their cooperation, and then using the proceeds of the drug trafficking to pay for their operations, especially when some of that heroin might well have ended up in the United States itself. And finally, my sixth principle I would highlight is the old principle of necessity. Is there any other reasonable way to achieve the authorized mission at lesser ethical risk? For example, by using some technical means, given that human agent operations generally carry higher ethical risk. And that's obviously true of agent operations against terrorist networks. But sometimes there is no other way of getting the information. And a case in point from the UK was that of Captain Robert Narak, who volunteered to go undercover after extensive training as an agent runner in the bandit territory of South Armagh and Northern Ireland in 1977. His cover was eventually blown and he was kidnapped by the IRA from a bar where he was waiting to meet an agent and severely tortured to make him reveal the identity of his agents. We know from other sources that he died under unspeakable torture, but stayed silent to protect the lives of his agents to whom he had given his word. Ethical dilemmas, which we can discuss, which I won't spend time on, arise, of course, when you're sharing intelligence with countries with different moral attitudes to the gathering and use of intelligence, such as over the use of torture or targeted killing. And ethical considerations apply to analysts too. How certain should an analyst be before reporting, for example, the geolocation of a high-value terrorist suspect when the next step might be very kinetic? At this point, we might ask a moral philosopher for advice on how to apply these principles. And she's likely to cite three schools of thought: the consequentialist or teleological approach, judging the rightness of an act by its consequences. Intelligence officers are natural consequences, consequentialists. This fits with their inclination to continue with operations that generate good results and stop when they don't pay off. But it raises the issue that if the threat is really, really grave, a big dirty bomb known to be ticking away somewhere in a city centre, would that justify torturing a suspect to reveal where it was? And that's really the case for adding a second form of ethical reasoning, the deontological approach that imports rules from outside the profession into the ethical code of intelligence officers, such as some of the provisions of the UN Declaration on Human Rights that the US and the UK signed up to, that contains the absolute ban on torture. A similar approach would say, let us put intelligence activity in accordance with the US Constitution and domestic law, and the equivalent for UK agencies operating under UK law. I'll just mention briefly a third approach, which the philosophers would identify, the so-called Aristotelic tradition, personal value ethics. How should one decent human being behave towards another? Respect for another's humanity, not just using them as a means to an end. Intelligence officers have to work in secret and sometimes alone and in conditions of stress and danger. And it's going to be down to the personal value ethics of the individual officer, whether she or he behaves properly, whatever the rules might say. In terms of recruiting agents, if you ask a former CIA or National Clandestine Service officer, they'll probably reply, mice, look for the mice, money, ideology, coercion or compromise, in other words, blackmail, and ego and excitement. In the Second World War, the ideological advantage was very much with the Soviet Union. They managed to persuade a lot of young people that communism was the real bulwark against fascism. And that motivated a number of spies in the Manhattan atom bomb project, in British intelligence, and so on. But by the time we'd had the 56 Soviet suppression of the Hungarian uprising and the 68 suppression in Czechoslovakia, it was offering money, bribery, and honey traps, the prostitutes, that enabled the recruitment of the likes of Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen, and the Western diplomats caught, many of them, in these honey traps in Moscow. The pendulum had therefore swung, and it was Soviet officers who were volunteering for ideological reasons to work for CIA and MI6 to help bring down the Soviet systems. Officers such as Colonel Gordievsky of the KGB, who had even became head of the KGB residency in the Soviet embassy in London while spying for MI6. Blackmail is not a method to be recommended. Apart from the ethical issue, the person being blackmailed will spend every waking moment trying to get out of the arm lock you have on them, and you can't trust their information, and they may even betray you in the hope of being forgiven by their authorities. But inducements can also be coercive. If you know a potential agent has a critically ill child and you offer to fix world-class treatment in New York, ethically, you're really leaving them no choice but to agree to help you. Here, such cases, strategic patience is more effective. An offer to help the family once they've volunteered their services will ensure their lasting gratitude and loyalty. Perhaps the most important Western counterintelligence agency of the Cold War was Mikhail Golinski, who was the deputy head of Czech counterintelligence, while simultaneously working as the KGB's undercover man in Prague. He knew of penetrations in all the NATO nations, indeed in the CIA itself, and he decided he would help the FBI to catch them. So he asked a US diplomat in Prague to pass his offer of service to J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. But the diplomat instead passed the letter to the CIA head of station, who then proceeded to run Golinski, pretending to be an FBI officer for some years. CIA then shared some of his hugely valuable counterintelligence information with MI6 in London, where sadly it passed over the desk of George Blake, himself a KGB double agent, who promptly told Moscow they had a leak. Golinski panicked and ran, and you can imagine his loss of confidence when he discovered he'd all along been run by CIA, not FBI, and that CIA had put his life in danger. Ego had played a big part in his thinking that he could get away with such a complex set of deceptions. Sadly, his grip on reality slipped, and he ended up embarrassing everyone by going public with the claim he was the last of the Romanovs and the heir to the Russian Tsar's fortune. Aftercare of burned out agents that go off the rails is a very heavy ethical responsibility. So, to conclude, the categorical imperative of the most famous moral philosopher of all, Immanuel Kant, demands we act only according to the maxim that at the same time our act should be regarded as a universal law. If we permit torture, we can hardly complain when others do it to us. For Kant, people cannot just be means to an end, but stealing secrets is what intelligence officers have to do. They will fall short of Kant's categorical imperative. They will at times have to manipulate and deceive and encourage agents to take risks. But ethical principles can still nevertheless govern those risks and the risks to their families, the agents' families, and the risks they may face when they retire. And a final point from me. In his memoirs, the former US Director of Central Intelligence, Admiral Stansfield Turner, wrote, "There's one overall test of the ethics of human intelligence activities, and that is whether those approving them feel they could defend their decisions before the public if the actions became public." That's the basis I've always given advice to British ministers. But the Admiral was clear about what he was not saying. His guideline doesn't say only authorize actions if you think the public would approve of them, if they knew of them. Rather, it says, be so convinced of the importance of the action that you would accept any criticism that might develop if the covert actions did become public, and you could therefore construct a convincing defense of the ethics of your decision. Let me pause there, and we can enter into some discussion later on.
Well, thank you, David. Yeah, we have plenty of questions already, but we'll have Mitt Regan give his presentation on covert action first.
All right.
Mitt,
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to talk today about what I call the ethics of acting covertly, which is essentially if there are any ethical issues in conducting an operation covertly as opposed to overtly. Now, just to go over some ground, I suspect most of you are familiar with a covert action is an operation in which state A intends to influence events in state B without having that operation attributed to itself. The U.S. Covert Action Statute defines covert action as an activity or activities of the United States government to influence political, economic, or military conditions abroad, where it is intended that the role of the United States government will not be apparent or acknowledged publicly. Now, covert action consists of a variety of different types of what I'll call substantive operations, information operations, psychological operations, political action, security and military assistance, direct action, actually involving the use of force. Each of those kinds of operations has been the focus of several analyses that address whether and how they could be justified or excused. There is, however, another level of potential ethical concern with respect to covert operations, apart from their substance. This is whether acting covertly rather than overtly in itself raises any distinctive ethical issue. In other words, even if an overt operation is substantially justified, does conducting it covertly rather than overtly require a separate ethical justification? Should there be at least a presumption that a state should take responsibility for efforts to influence events in other states? If so, even activities that are justified if done overtly would require separate justification for being conducted covertly. There appears to be an intuition on the part of many that acting covertly is not entirely reputable, but there's been surprisingly little attention to whether this intuition has any ethical basis. So what I'm hoping today is unpack that intuition and try to answer that question. Now, to start, we might think that covert action is simply engaging in secrecy. That is, keeping the identity of a state secret. And if we regard covert action as simply keeping a secret, it may not necessarily be problematic. As Cecilia Bach has noted, we accept that some measure of secrecy is appropriate and even desirable in ordinary affairs. As she says, whereas I take lying to be prima facie wrong with a negative presumption against it, secrecy need not be. Whereas every lie stands in need of justification, all secrets do not. So this suggests that there should at least be no presumption against secrecy by states, right? That they are not necessarily engaging in a wrong or violating rights if they conduct operations in secret, right? In some cases, however, a secret may be what Dennis Thompson and Amy Gutman call a deceptive secret. As they describe it, an official who conceals information with the intention of causing people to believe something the official knows is false creates a deceptive secret. Keeping secret the identity of a state responsible for an operation thus arguably involves not only secrecy, but deception. It's meant to mislead people into believing that a state is not responsible for an operation it has conducted. Right? And a state's failure to acknowledge responsibility, in essence, is meant to create the false impression that it played no role in bringing about the events in question. And one could say that this is the case regardless of whether a state explicitly denies responsibility or simply fails to admit it. So I call this attribution deception. Now, with respect to deception, as compared to secrecy, there is a stronger consensus that it's wrong, even though it may be justified in some circumstances. Right? In other words, there may be a presumption against deception, which requires that one justify engaging in it as a general matter. This is true in general. Does it also apply to attribution deception, as I've defined it in particular? If attribution deception is a wrong that requires justification, then deciding to act covertly rather than overtly could be subject to the demands of just war theory. Right? One might say that even if, say, providing security assistance to a government or resources to an opposition group in another state is not wrongful, doing so covertly is. In terms of the just war tradition, we could say that acting covertly is subject to the jus ad bellum. Right? Among other things, it would need to be a last resort, done only when acting overtly would not be effective in achieving a just aim. I think, however, that in the realm of international relations, this claim is too strong. Now, states generally reserve the prerogative, frankly, to deceive one another and to anticipate that other states will do the same if they believe this will further the interests of the citizens for whom they have a responsibility. Right? Now, while there may be some exceptions, I think at least in the realm of international affairs, we can look to state practice for a notion of what rights and obligations apply to states, right, vis-a-vis one another. And I don't think that states believe they have a right against being deceived, nor an obligation not to deceive others. We can't say, I think, that as a general principle, there's a presumption against deception, including, I would say, attribution deception. Nonetheless, as I'm going to argue, I think that different parties, including states, may be wronged by attribution deception in particular operations. Now, how do I define being wronged? Right? I define it as the violation of a right that a party has to information about the identity of a state responsible for conducting an operation. Right? When a party has such a right, right, acting covertly, engaging in attribution deception, violates that right and therefore is in need of justification. Now, I hasten to say that what I'm going to discuss today is really only one half of the analysis. Right? A full ethical analysis of acting covertly must identify what, if any, harms, or I should say wrongs, flow from engaging in attribution deception, acting covertly, and must also analyze what justifications may be available, right, for violating that right. I think it's useful, however, at least as a preliminary matter, to start by trying to unpack whether anyone has a right to know the identity of a state that is engaged in an activity. Right? So this is, as I say, sort of a threshold preliminary analysis, certainly not a full ethical analysis, but my hope is that it helps clarify some of the issues, and is particularly why there may be some intuitive unease about acting covertly. I want to suggest that some parties may plausibly be claimed to be wronged by different types of operations that are conducted covertly rather than overtly, but others may not. Now, as a practical matter, it may, of course, be infeasible to disclose the identity of the state to a party who's entitled to it, but not to others. Right? And may well be difficult, in other words, to confine attribution to certain discrete audiences based on whether they have an entitlement to that information. One may therefore claim that as long as one group is entitled to information about attribution, a state could no longer, as a practical matter, conduct certain kinds of operations covertly at all, right? That's a fair point, I think, but I believe for a couple of reasons that it's worth identifying those parties who may or may not be wronged by acting covertly. First, such analysis can clarify what kinds of interests are at stake and the magnitude of those interests in choosing to act covertly. Making those kinds of distinctions and clarifying them should contribute to the rigor and depth of ethical analysis regarding a decision to act covertly. Second, when disclosure to one group entitled information unavoidably means disclosure to another group who is not, the weight of the first group's interest and the risk of disclosure to the second, who is not entitled to the information, could lead to an all things considered judgment that an operation can be conducted covertly. Right? In order to arrive at that kind of judgment, however, we need as refined an analysis as possible of the potential wrongs imposed by conducting an operation covertly. Okay, so who might be wronged by attribution deception? Put differently, who, if anyone, might be entitled to information about attribution? Right? One group arguably is the citizens of the state that is conducting the activity. Right? The liberal democratic principle of self-determination provides a powerful basis for claiming that attribution deception wrongs the citizens of a state that acts covertly because it deprives them of the information they need to hold officials politically accountable. We might cite to Kant's publicity principle as an expression of this idea. Right? As David Omand has put it, that principle says a decision maker must ask, could I still get away with this if the fact I'm doing it were publicly known? Right? And one might argue that a state that believes that it can only act if it acts covertly is violating this principle. I think, however, if we think of the principle as applying to general rules and policies rather than specific decisions, then a state can act consistently with it if it informs the public that it may be necessary in some cases to engage in covert action, which it will not disclose to the public, right? And that it has in place institutional mechanisms that provide for democratic oversight of covert activities, right? By doing so, I think a state honors the principle of democratic self-determination that I would argue is the foundation of the publicity principle. Now, it's an empirical matter whether particular mechanisms in place are adequate. I think there's a good argument that the U.S. Covert Action Statute has a robust system of oversight, right, that arguably does satisfy that. So with respect to citizens of a state that wants to act covertly, I believe that it can satisfy its obligations to them and thereby not wrong them by acting covertly, engaging in attribution deception under the conditions that I've specified. But are there other parties who might have a right to know the identity of a state involved in various activities, right? First of all, there may be, but I don't believe the publicity principle would be the foundation of that right. I see that principle as fundamentally rooted in the value of self-determination and political accountability of a sovereign to its people, right? So I think that those obligations are confined to the constituents, the citizens, the members of a particular polity. But what about other groups and other parties, and what about other grounds? What about other states? I don't believe that as a general matter, other states are entitled to information about the identity of a state engaged in an operation. Again, with respect to attribution, states don't appear to believe that they have a right to information about the identity of other states that engage in a variety of activities, or that they are violating other states' rights themselves when they engage in attribution deception. States know other states engage in it, and they wish to preserve the ability to do that themselves. Right? While there may be specific instances in which a particular state has a claim that it's been wronged by another state acting covertly, I don't think there is a general expectation of entitlement to attribution information among states. Now, one might say that states want to preserve the option to engage in covert action, but they also want to prohibit operations that threaten to disrupt the fragile norms that enable states to cooperate. So we might say then, well, with respect to any obligations to states, we should model the permissions and constraints, right, the rights and obligations regarding acting covertly, as the product of agreement among states behind a veil of ignorance. And acting covertly is wrong when it violates the norms that emerge from this process. Now, there's a long, some would call it contractarian tradition similar to this. Michael Skirker's presentation on intelligence rights of foreign officials earlier in the week, draws on this. And one might say the best indication of this is international law. States may have obligations under specific treaties or other sources of international law, but there's no general duty of attribution disclosure under this body of law, right? So we could say that any obligations of a state, right, with respect to disclosure of its identity, right, should simply mirror those in international law, which reflects a modus vivendi among states with respect to covert action. I think this approach is inadequate, however. I think if we rely simply on a modus vivendi, it reflects the traditional view that states are the only relevant actors with moral status in the international arena. Now, this traditionally was the view when sovereignty was regarded as inviolable, right? And the notion that the interests of individuals were derivative of the interests of states of which they're members. But in the last few years, there's been increasing emphasis on the idea that individuals have rights based on their intrinsic worth and dignity rather than solely their political membership. So it's possible, I think, to imagine that the interests of states and the interests of individuals within them might not be completely coterminous. If that's the case, we can't assume that states automatically will act as agents in negotiating a modus vivendi that fully protect the human rights of their subjects. So I think we have to consider whether attribution deception deprives individuals, not simply states, of information to which they're entitled. All right? Now, let me just close by giving an example of how one might go about trying to assess whether acting covertly might violate rights in a particular situation. All right? One form of covert action is providing resources to opposition groups against the government in another state. Right? And for various reasons, some of them quite obvious, a state may want to do that covertly. All right? Does acting covertly in providing this assistance violate the right of any party to information, right? What about the government of the state in question, right? A government might claim that it is entitled to such information based on its responsibility to exercise sovereignty in the name of and for the benefit of its citizens, right? In order to fulfill this responsibility, a state must have an informed understanding of the opinions and wishes of all its citizens, right? And information that another state is providing assistance to an opposition group and thereby amplifying its voice in domestic political debate would be important to the government, the argument goes, in gaining an accurate assessment of domestic political sentiment. Does this sentiment reflect genuine indigenous views? How much is it influenced by the interests of other states, right, outside it. Right? The argument is both sides should have information about the extent to which views are expressed in domestic political debate may be influenced by the interests of other states, right? And ignorance of this assistance may effectively prevent a state from defending itself. So that could be a prima facie argument. I won't delve into it more deeply. What about citizens of the state? Right? Those who are not part of the opposition, who obviously know about the assistance, right? Might they be wronged by being left unaware that a foreign state has an interest in fostering opposition to their government? Right? Well, arguably, I think they could have a claim because being deprived of this information, right, arguably deprives them of the opportunity fully to assess the persuasive force of the arguments of regime opponents and the extent to which they may reflect genuine indigenous sentiment as opposed to the influences of other states. In other words, they could argue that being deprived of this information deprives them of information they need to engage in meaningful self-determination. They have a right to know when fellow citizens opposed to the government are receiving this kind of assistance, right? And then finally, I don't believe other states are necessarily entitled to information about the identity of a state that's providing such assistance, unless such assistance goes so far as to constitute what's called under international law unlawful intervention, which is an intrusion on the core sovereign functions of another state. If that's the case, if it's unlawful, I think all states have an interest in knowing about it, because the way that international law is sustained is through criticism and commentary by states. And so depriving other states of this information when such assistance does cross the line into unlawful intervention, thereby inhibits the development of international law. Now, I haven't engaged by any means in a full analysis of the potential interests of the parties that I've described, but I wanted at least to lay out how we might begin to think about and approach the question of whether acting covertly in itself, regardless of the substance of an operation, might raise ethical issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitt. Any spotlight there. We're all set up. Oh, all right. A lot of interesting issues on the table here. That's a revision of your original paper, Mitt. It's getting better and better.
Well, thanks to the seminar at the Naval Academy. But you're right. I have rethought some parts of it.
Yeah, it's great. A variety of questions. I'll paraphrase and combine some of them. The first one would go to Sir David, and we've read, at least, that during the Cold War, the two sides over time constructed and then generally abided by rules. So if this is true, what were those rules? And were they similar to the use in intelligentium rules that you outlined? So in other words, was this kind of a organic, as they say, process of kind of reciprocity, mutual agreement, implied consent, if you will, that emerged over time, or not? And then that's related question then, if this is true, does the same situation exist now with current adversaries, say China and or ISIS?
I think you'd be hard put to, yeah, indeed. I think you would be hard put to find evidence in the archives of there being any sort of genuine understanding, say, between the Soviet Union and, say, the US, or the US and the UK. There were certain behaviors. So assassination of your political opponents was something that the Soviet Union engaged in since the 1920s. But you didn't go around assassinating the political leaders, or indeed the intelligence chiefs of your adversary nations. And that was kind of reciprocated. It would have been very easy to conduct such as assassinations or very highly violent disruptive activity. And for the most part, that didn't happen. So you can think of a sort of prisoner's dilemma type game theory, and you end up somewhere where actually it's better if you don't. But, you know, the poisoned umbrella that dealt with Gregory Markov on Westminster Bridge, he was in that category. Today, the attempt to murder Colonel Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury was seen by many as a breach of an unwritten convention because Skripal had been spy swapped. So he'd been caught, he'd been sentenced, he'd been spy swapped. And as far as the Russia was concerned, that should have been the end of the matter. But it wasn't. And they went out to try and kill him using an extraordinary method, the Novichok nerve agent. It must be assumed to deliver a signal to their own troops that don't think you can get away these days with betraying Russia. The penalty will be severe. And the murder of Litvinenko in London using polonium-210, another former intelligence officer who helped the West, that kind of signaling was going on. So I think it would be too much to say there was an unwritten sort of set of rules. Behaviors that were liable to provoke retaliation of a kind you didn't want were probably best avoided. I had whilst I've got the floor, I'd love to have an answer to looking at Mitt. What about the ethical obligations to those who take part in covert operations? They're supposed to be unattributable. They're deniable operations. The government will wash its hands of it and say, no, it wasn't us. But what happens when people get caught? We had such a case in the UK many years ago, at the time of Colonel Penkovsky, when one of his couriers was a British businessman, Greville Wynne, who had volunteered, you know, he'd been approached, he'd volunteered his services, but on the basis you're helping us, but if you get caught, you're on your own. And he was caught, and he spent years in a Soviet prison till he too was eventually spy swapped, because the British government didn't want to admit that he was anything other than innocent. And you can see such cases around the world today. So what are the ethical responsibilities if you are using someone on one of these operations, and if by bad luck or mischance they get caught, are you going to admit to them?
Well, I think that in a case like that, you know, one could argue that as long as it's clear at the outset to the agent that will be the consequence, that there is an argument, I think, you know, based on consent there, that if they are fully informed and they are knowledgeable about, you know, the consequences of what they're doing, you know, that would be the case. It's interesting. I've heard some suggest that one of the reasons the U.S. military, at least, has been somewhat reluctant to engage in, you know, what are genuine covert actions, is the notion of disavowing knowledge of someone, leaving someone behind, right, is really strongly antithetical to the sense of loyalty and commitment, you know, within the units that the military tries to reinforce, right? But I think I'd be interested in Ed's thoughts on this too. But my sense is, at least as a preliminary matter, that consent could ground the justification as long as there was genuine consent, as long as someone now, you know, I suspect that in some cases, there may not be sort of full information provided, because the concern is, well, maybe the agent will decide not to do it in that case, and so we'll leave things a little ambiguous. And I can imagine that's an ethical, that's certainly an ethical question in and of itself.
Yeah, I agree with that analysis, Mitt. I mean, you could use a necessary and lesser evil justification too if you wanted to go that route, but that's it's not obviously not a rights-based one. So,
but I think you're absolutely right to point to the special issues which surround a serving member of the armed forces. They may volunteer, but all the same, if they're engaged in an activity that the government is intent on denying is their responsibility, can you really leave them swinging in the wind? We've certainly had a case I can recall in my time in British government service, where eventually the government said, no, you can't leave them there. We're going to have to own up to this.
Stephen Woodside, are you still here? Yeah, I see you. You want to ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, gentlemen. This is for David. So yeah, I appreciated the point that inducements can also be coercive. And I don't know enough about the intelligence communities, but I suspect that many of them perhaps permit inducements while prohibiting negative sanctions like torture or blackmail. And perhaps that's because they don't appreciate your point. And I just wonder if those discussions are happen in the intelligence communities on where to draw that line, and whether the line is correctly drawn between inducements and negative sanctions.
Shall I? Yeah, I think the answer is they are actively debated. And if you like, the rules change over time. What might have been thought to be permissible 40 years ago might well not be thought to be appropriate today. And they also change in relation to the international circumstances. So if you're in a state of war or existential danger, then you're going to find operations get authorized that wouldn't get authorized in peacetime, which is a sort of proportionality argument that it's really not necessary because we don't face such a severe threat. So the British intelligence agencies, the three national agencies, all have mandatory ethics training. There's quite a lot of debate about that. I think the consequentialist argument tends to win, that if you are really intent on generating an agent in place, somebody who is going to help you in place, then they are taking significant risks. You have a duty to help them in every way possible, and their families. As long as it's clear at the outset, Mitt's point, then you've got a consent, you've got a relationship which you cannot then break. So the fictions of John le Carré, which often tend to involve betrayal of one or an agent being sacrificed for another agent, and we've seen the old Soviet Union do that minnows would get sacrificed to protect the position of somebody, an agent that's better placed. That's just unacceptable because it trashes the reputation of the organization when these things get known.
Well, piggybacking then on Stephen's question, David, you mentioned in your presentation the principle of discrimination. So I think that certainly at least implies that there are some targets that can be intentionally harmed. And so how do you draw that line? Is the line drawn at security and intelligence officers who can then be intentionally deceived and harmed in other ways?
Yes, again, it comes back to Mitt's point about consent. So you have an agent, you have a relationship with that agent, you may be paying them. Quite often during the Cold War, you didn't really have to pay. The people volunteered their services. But and in that case, the payment is often really just a reinforcing, psychological reinforcement mechanism rather than the inducement. But you have this situation where the relationship you have is essentially based on a transaction of some sort, psychological transaction, consent. But that doesn't apply to the family of the agent. They may well know nothing whatever about it. And some notable British cases, they didn't. It took President Reagan's full force of persuasion eventually to get Gordievsky's family out, persuading Gorbachev that despite the fact that he had betrayed his country, nonetheless his family shouldn't suffer. So minimizing risks to the family, and there are sort of other occasions in which a human intelligence operation could, if it backfires, if it goes wrong, could harm innocent people. So I think having that principle of discrimination, where it's most used these days is actually in the digital intelligence field, preventing mass surveillance, sort of being able to separate out your genuine targets, the suspects you want information from the great mass of the population you have no interest in it, and certainly don't want to invade their privacy if you can possibly help it. But it also does occur, I think, in the HUMINT field.
If I could follow up, Ed, if it's all right. David, I know you write in your book with Mark Pisian, you mentioned the agent who's an IRA enforcer. And, the broader phenomenon is, in order for an agent to remain credible with the organization that, of which he's a member and which he's penetrated, there may be the need to engage in certain abominable behavior, right? Or perhaps not to act on intelligence that you've received and allow something to go forward, right? So that he is not identified as a source of information. How do we deal with those kinds of situations?
Yeah, there's a spectrum, and at one end of the spectrum, by having an agent inside a terrorist or criminal organization, they're breaking the law. If you take Al Qaeda, prohibited organization in the UK, your agent is breaking the law. So somehow you have to get over that legal hurdle. The UK law gives the Secretary of State the right to sign a certificate to permit law breaking. And so it's not a conspiracy for intelligence officers to plan to recruit this guy and thereby break the law. Criminal conspiracy to break the law. So that's at one extreme. At the other extreme would be, can you permit your agent to, in order to bolster his credentials, conduct a killing? Think of ISIS, think of the beheadings. And the answer to that is absolutely not. And somehow you've got to steer the course between those two extremes. Certainly British, when this legislation was passed, Parliament was reassured it's not a license to murder. There is no license to kill. British ministers can't authorize, the assassination by an intelligence officer, and they're given that assurance to Parliament. So that's at one extreme. And at the other, you have this rather minor technical violation that somebody is a member of a prohibited organization. I think the key to it is thinking ethically, accepting that you're in a difficult situation, and therefore there's an obligation to think through the stages of this recruitment and then running this agent, and what safeguards you can put in place to protect your own organization, to protect the nation, if the agent were to go over the boundary into behavior you shouldn't accept. At its, I can think of real cases where the response has been cease operation. You cannot run this individual. This is beyond an ethically acceptable boundary, and the British government would not be able to defend this behaviour. So sometimes you have to pass up on opportunities, but it's usually possible to find a way. And anyway, the agent, the provisional IRA example is a real extreme. And I hasten to say I'm neither confirming nor denying that any such operation went on. I'm just relying on the widespread reporting of the case. That's very much an extreme. The more normal case would be where you have recruited somebody who's close to the organization, might be the individual who's providing their burner phones, rather a useful person to have in your pocket. That's the more likely situation than that you've actually got a killer on your hands.
Thank you. Question to Mitt. You were discussing the possibilities of claim rights to attribution, and you first talked about the government, and then third, other states, and then secondly, you talked about citizens. Citizens would have a claim right to know who was providing, say, military assistance to a rebel group. Could you say a little bit more about why the foundation of that right? No.
It's based essentially on their right of self-determination. And their right to information that's relevant to exercise that right of self-determination. And I think to know that another state is intervening in some way, perhaps not, in a way that has crossed the line into unlawful intervention, but that is intervening and providing resources to a group, right? The provision of those resources, to some extent, let's say the opposition group does gain power. Well, to what extent will the new government then be beholden to some extent to the state that has provided it with assistance, right? And so, again, this is a sort of a prima facie claim. There may be justifications for acting covertly in that case, but it seems to me that it's rooted in the idea that those citizens have a right to all relevant information in order to exercise that right. And in particular, I think, it's particularly significant the extent to which other states may be attempting to influence the political dynamics within a state. So that would be my basis for that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm just thinking the right might go even deeper than that. Not only the right to know, but the right to approve based on self-determination.
Well, I don't know. I think that the right to prove ultimately would be, sort of at the ballot box, right? In other words, they decide ultimately whether they feel that knowing that another state has been involved, they make a judgment about the extent to which that creates a danger that somehow the political decisions made within their own state will not fully reflect the interest of the members of that state.
Okay. One thing that occurred to me is when I was thinking about your third category, other states, is that there could be a real problem to other states in that if you don't attribute, then another state might be one of the usual suspects that didn't do it and therefore might be, say, even attacked as a result. So this isn't just pinning it on them purposely, but just leaving it vague is itself a problem.
That's a possibility. I don't know if that's strong enough that to give rise to a claim of rights in that case, I think. And I guess I'd be reluctant to say that it would, but certainly that can be a consequence in some cases of not acknowledging attribution. That there may be some states that are more likely than to be suspected of that. I think it would be difficult to determine which states might fall into that category and which states therefore might be entitled to have a right which means that, well, if there were such a right, it would have to be the entire international community. And I think that that's too strong a claim, I think, because I think that there are going to be dynamics and consequences of state behavior that necessarily second, third order effects that occur. But I don't think that the possibility of those would necessarily give rise to a claim of right.
We're getting near the end. I wanted to ask a midshipman question, and this is historical. So if you don't know the details, that's fine. I don't. But he was wondering if you could discuss, this is Carson Hillier, if you could discuss the 1953 US and UK backed Iranian coup from your perspective, just or not, would be the question.
Two questions arise. One, just or not, seen through the eyes at the time. And the second would be a consequentialist argument.
Yeah.
Did it in the long run turn out to be actually a strategic error, since it probably precipitated eventually, bringing back the Shah was one thing, but that probably precipitated the opposition eventually. And look where we are with Iran now, which is a general point which I think I would make about covert operations, that very often they end up biting you. You know, arming the Taliban, which we did. It helped drive the Russians out, but perhaps we should have left the Russians to hold that particular problem rather than take it on ourselves. So most of these covert operations don't actually have happy outcomes. Sort of the micro covert operations do, where you're running intelligence operations and gathering intelligence and possibly doing a little bit of influence. But the same was true of the Soviet Union. Most of their operations, as chronicled by Vasily Mitrokhin, for example, they didn't really get them very far. Can
you think of a just, including successful covert operation that you can talk about?
You would have to, I mean, certainly if you go back to the Second World War, there are plenty.
Right.
I'll just give you one, which is the double cross system. So every German agent that was landed in the United Kingdom during the Second World War was rounded up, identified, rounded up, and given the choice, be executed in the Tower of London or cooperate. Most of them said, we'll cooperate. They then fed back false information to the German High Command. When the V-1 rockets were being fired at London, they used the network to feed back false information about where the rockets were landing. They then, the Germans readjusted their aiming point, thinking that the rockets were all landing to the north, pulling. This meant that more of the rockets landed in the south of London, where population density was lower, and there were over 10,000 casualties saved as a result of that deception. Right. So you can find quite a lot of examples where deception type operations, but I suppose the other one I would point to is the US and UK interference in the elections in Greece and Italy on the side of the Christian Democrats, when at a time when it looked as if the communist parties in those countries could actually take over. And the justification for interfering in a democratic process was that once the communists took over, the first thing they'd do is declare a one-party state, pull up the drawbridge, and that would be the last election those countries would have seen. And I happen to believe that's what would have happened. So stopping a communist takeover through the ballot box was a major issue of policy. The CIA did most of the funding, and the MI6 and British intelligence were deeply involved, and as was the Foreign Office. And most of it was bankrolling the originators of men who founded the European Community and then the European Union were bankrolled by the CIA.
And those are cases, as well, in which the Soviet Union was also actively involved.
Yeah.
Right. So it wasn't a case of one-way, intervention into an otherwise, I think
it's one of life's little ironies that Adenauer and Schuman and all these great figures of European construction, at the end of the war, the European nations were bankrupt. There was no money for political parties. The United States, Churchill approached the US and said, "Can't you help?" And the US did. And that cemented democracy in place in Western Europe. Now, I think that's worth the kind of deceptions that had to go on to keep this hidden, because it wouldn't have worked if it had been generally known. And that's history, which is now in the archives. It's all open. There's no secret about any of that now.
I think some would also argue that the assistance to the solidarity movement in Poland, in the 1980s, was justified. I mean, Poland doesn't seem to be moving in a desirable direction at the moment, but so you can't ever tell what ultimate consequences there may be. But I think that many people would regard that as just.
Right. Well, next week we're going to cover gray zone operations. So there's a part 2 to this whole conference, Monday through Thursday next week. And is it fair to say to both of you that covert action would be part of so-called gray zone ops?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's meant to fall below the level of certainly armed attack,
right,
or certainly what we think of as warfare.
Right.
And so yes, and ambiguous attribution is certainly a significant instrument, with gray zone tactics. So
there is a bit of a paradox that you actually want your actions, although you're publicly denying them, you want the other side to know.
Yeah, right.
And that applies both ways.
Right.
Yeah. Rory Cormack, I don't know if you've read his book on covert action in the UK, has this term implausible deniability. So precisely that. So one could imagine that the Russians probably were not so concerned that we eventually learned that they had some involvement in the 2016 election, because that it sends a message of a sort.
We're a world power. We can do that kind of stuff.
Right.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Sir David, you're welcome to join us if you have time next week for any of the presentations on the gray zone. We're going to be looking into the ethical issues associated with that, especially responding to gray zone harms. And Mitt, I'll see you next week at some point during that.
Yeah. Well, thanks for organizing a great week, Ed. It's really been a really terrific set of programs. I'm looking forward to next week. And David, thank you. It's good to see you again.
I do.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone for attending, and have a great weekend, and hopefully see you on Monday.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.